Welcome back to Uprising. I'm Sonali Kolhatkar. It wasn't just Walmart workers who chose the biggest shopping day of the year to make their demands. Activists angered over the St. Louis grand jury decision to not indict former Ferguson officer Darren Wilson with charges relating to the shooting death of teenager Michael Brown also called for a boycott in protest. In fact, under the banner of #blackout, protesters shut down the St. Louis Galleria Mall. Solidarity protests were held in cities around the country. In Oakland, activists occupied a BART station and shut it down, leading to more than a dozen arrests. In Los Angeles, where the largest number of people outside Ferguson have been arrested, more than 300, people blocked freeways. In Ferguson itself, tensions remain high as people continue their protests despite a short lull during Thanksgiving. A church attended by Michael Brown's father was burnt down in the past week. Some suspect members of the KKK of being behind the possible arson attack. Meanwhile, since the grand jury decision was announced last week, legal experts and scholars have examined the evidence released and the procedure itself, concluding that the entire process could have been flawed right from the start. Darren Wilson himself has reportedly been paid $500,000 for sharing his story with the press, saying that he had a clear conscience. My guest is Lisa Bloom. She's a legal analyst for The Today Show, NBC News, and Avo.com. She's the New York Times bestselling author of Swagger and Think. Her latest book is Suspicion Nation, the inside story of the Trayvon Martin injustice and why we continue to repeat it. She runs her own law firm in Los Angeles called The Bloom Firm. Welcome to Uprising, Lisa.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us. Well, one of the things that has been making the rounds of social media is an opinion written by Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia in the 1992 case of United States versus Williams. And in it, he explained what the role of a grand jury was, that its function is to not to inquire upon what foundation the charge may be denied or otherwise to try the suspect's defenses, but only to examine upon what foundation the charge is made by the prosecutor. And so he basically made the case that the person has never been thought to have a right to testify or to have exculpatory evidence presented. How unusual was it for Darren Wilson to directly address the grand jury that's deciding whether or not to indict him and to present exculpatory evidence?
What you're pointing out is such an important issue. Look, the first problem here is that Michael Brown was shot and killed. The second problem is the completely biased way in which this grand jury proceeding was handled. So different from the way that other grand juries go down in this country, and indeed in St. Louis. Indeed, this very grand jury, which had heard a number of other cases before they turned to this matter, and all of the other cases were handled according to standard operating procedure, which is you put on one or two witnesses, just have a little bit of evidence to establish probable cause. The defendant is charged, and then they prepare for a full-blown trial or a plea bargain, more likely. In this case, it was completely different, and I've read a substantial part of the thousands of pages of this grand jury, of the transcripts, and the prosecutors, even in that grand jury room, say over and over again, this case is different. We're doing everything different in this grand jury room, which is completely contrary, by the way, to what the prosecutor, Bob McCullough, said in his press conference, that this was handled like any other grand jury. I mean, that is a completely false statement.
So what do you make of the photographs that were presented of Darren Wilson's injuries? He said he had a facial contusion, but honestly, the photos show a slight reddening on the side of his jaw. And of course, he was able to talk directly to the grand jury in presenting this. From looking at those photographs, how would you judge them?
Well, what's completely outrageous to me as a trial lawyer is that Darren Wilson was never asked any tough questions. And the one that jumped out at me immediately was his story that Mike Brown punched him full force, he said, twice in the face. Mike Brown, a big, strong, healthy young man. If he had punched him full force twice in the face, you would expect more than what we see in those photos. If you look at those photos, and it's about 2 or 3 pages in the transcript where they're saying, you know, where is the injury? Can I see it? Maybe it's another photograph. Let me look at a different one. I still don't see it. Maybe this photograph. And if you look at the photos, as I have, you sort of turn them sideways and squint, you can kind of sort of see a little pinkness or a little redness on his face. It is completely inconsistent with his story. Add to that the redness is on the right side of his face. Now, he is sitting in the car, as I am to you. I am the Darren Wilson person, right? On the right side, he says that Mike Brown punched him with the right hand. How he would have reached around through the car all the way around to the right side is really hard to believe. It's possible, but let's see you reenact it, Mr. Wilson. You shot and killed an unarmed kid. I don't think it's too much to ask in a grand jury proceeding. Let's have a reenactment. Let's bring in a mannequin, and let's see how this all works together and if your story is even possible. None of that happened. In fact, we know that Darren Wilson was allowed to wash his hands a couple of times. We know that his gun was never fingerprinted to prove one of the most important parts of his story. He says that Mike Brown grabbed the gun, not just reached for it, but grabbed it, and that they were both having a skirmish back and forth with the gun. He says Mike Brown turned it in towards his pelvis. Let's see the fingerprints on the gun. We know there's blood on the gun. Blood can travel through the air. Fingerprints can't. Why on earth was that gun not fingerprinted? And I call on the federal investigators now. It's not too late. Fingerprint that gun. Show me Michael Brown's fingerprints on that gun.